Welcome, everybody. It's great to see some of you. And I'm really excited to have this, I guess, first of what's going to be a series of free monthly webinars. And so let's get right into it. So the title of today's talk is Leaving the Upside Down, How Scapegoat Survivors Learn to Live Right Side Up. And I want to just make a note that when it comes to kind of how to maybe track what's talked about today, give me 1 second. I have to move okay. I'd advise you to just kind of sit back and take in what I'm about to say. When it comes to notes or kind of retaining the content, you'll get an email at about 30 minutes after the conclusion of this that'll have all the information you need. It'll have a link to these slides and the notes accompanying them, a recording of this meeting, and the free access to a free tool that I'm going to get to a little bit later in the presentation. So with all that kind of in place, yeah, I'd encourage you to kind of sit back, notice, and sort of free associate to whatever I'm presenting that might correspond to your own experience, whether now, then, or wherever. With that, I wanted to start with a story. So as an undergraduate in college, my favorite subject was by far psychology, maybe to no surprise, because I love thinking and learning about how our minds work and how we function, for better or worse, in our closest relationships. And I couldn't really think of anything more satisfying than a career as a psychologist. But I grew pretty intimidated when I looked at the acceptance rates for graduate school programs in clinical psychology, but I decided to give it a shot anyway. So I sort of made it at that time my mission in life to build up a strong application to these programs. And give me 1 second. I would find professors on campus that I could volunteer in their research labs, and then also kind of created this very intensive study regimen to try to get my grades up as much as possible. And I'm just going to check the chat. Oh, okay. I'm glad people can hear. Okay. In any case, kind of made everything about trying to establish as good an application to the grad school as possible. Anyway, after doing all this, I was delighted and pretty surprised to be granted admission to a couple programs. But I'm understating what getting into these programs meant to me at the time. Because for as long as I could remember at that juncture, I'd been having to stay ahead of a sort of terrible feeling of dread, inadequacy, and a sense of insignificance that I sort of consistently would fear of kind of swallowing me up if I didn't continually find proof that my existence meant something. And at that moment, I hoped, that period of time, I had hoped that getting into a graduate school would demonstrate such significance to myself, and hopefully once and for all. But as with every such project I'd undertaken in life up until then, that wasn't how it worked out. So once I got to graduate school, there weren't any more roadblocks in front of achieving this dream. All I really had to do was study the subject that I knew I loved, participate in the classes that I found so interesting, complete the tasks required of me as a research assistant, and then work on my master's thesis, which zoomed out would all be pretty good things. But it would become harder and harder to do these things. I might sit down to read articles or books for a project and be unable to focus. Then I'd grow anxious at falling behind and scramble to get projects done at the last minute. Or an encroaching sense of meaninglessness would sort of sap my motivation to be diligent in getting my tasks done as a research assistant. And that would result in several errors that caused distress for the professors I was working for. So the enthusiasm and wonder I used to have for reading about clinical psychology began to go away. It all began to feel like a chore. And I had no idea why at the time. I just thought that there must be something really wrong with me. I must be lazy, unreliable, or someone who couldn't be trusted to do a good job. And I can't say that this story had an immediate happy ending. My difficulties working at the capacity that the program required ultimately resulted in me being asked to leave the program. And I felt quite humiliated and crestfallen as a result. But at the same time, I knew that I couldn't imagine succeeding. It was as if it was as if things had to happen this way. Like a life where I got to work in a profession that I liked and was competent in, and also competent in, seemed utterly impossible. When I tried to visualize that outcome, my mind would quite literally prevent me from seeing anything. But living under the auspices of feeling like a failure, doubtful of my own abilities, was extremely familiar, and one that I knew how to navigate for kind of as long as I could remember. So for about a year, I then lived with the understanding that my trial run in graduate school was just yet another piece of evidence that showed how flawed I must be. But then I got into a long-term therapy where for the first time, I got to understand that the ways I was raised were highly unusual, abusive, and ultimately not my fault. That I had been the scapegoat to a narcissistic parent where they had had to devalue, deprive, and domineer me in order to keep themselves sort of intact, or you could say their exaggerated yet fragile self-worth intact. So over the course of treatment, my therapist and I got to understand how success and graduate school, back in the episode I was describing, just felt far too dangerous to make a reality at that juncture in life. It wasn't that I was incapable of doing the work, but that I had no psychological world to inhabit where I could feel safe to know and live from strengths. But I'm happy to say that, after almost 20 years since I started that journey, I have come back to the field that I've loved the whole time, and now see the pangs of anxiety or disorientation that occur in so doing as old signals of what used to be dangerous when living in the way I think, I was particularly designed to live in. And I'm offering this story just as one example of what life in the upside down world can be and feel like, and to sketch a path out of that world to one that's right side up, where you get to know and build your life around your sense of worth, interest, and unique capabilities. So with all that kind of as an introduction, here's what you're going to leave today's webinar with: an understanding of how and why a scapegoat child's world gets turned upside down, where growth is forbidden and self-diminishment feels stabilizing, what living in that upside down world is like, 2 reasons why it's so hard to leave this world no matter how painful it is, what you need to exit this world towards one that's right side up. And then for the last 15 minutes, I'll address some of the questions that some of you submitted when signing up for today's webinar. So let's get started or continue. And I just want to check the chat again to make sure. Okay, good. So who is the scapegoat child? I mean, it's likely everyone's maybe quite versed in this, but I didn't feel it was right to start the presentation without just an overview. So maybe if we start with a narcissistic parent, I would sort of suggest that they suffer from a core sense of worthlessness that has to be denied and instead found in the people around them. And a child born to such a parent risks becoming the person who kind of is who the parent's worthlessness gets thrusted onto. This can happen where instead of the parent acknowledging how worthless they in fact feel themselves, they unconsciously relocate this sense of worthlessness into their child. But that's not yet enough for the parent to believe it's their child who's worthless. For that to happen, they'd have to act in ways to influence their child to think, act, and feel like they in fact are the worthless ones. So for example, a narcissistic parent may pride themselves on having perfect manners at all times, when in fact they may fear being seen as quite a slovenly person. They might manage such a fear by seeing what they dread in themselves to occur in their child. So maybe such a parent would start criticizing their child at the dinner table for putting elbows on the table, or not chewing every bite with their mouth closed, or supposedly eating too fast. Now the child in this example feels the way the parent was afraid of feeling. that the child's natural way of eating their meal repulses people around them. And this leads and can lead to the child feeling worthless, and then the parent feeling as though they have unconsciously rid themselves of the feelings that they feared, that of being kind of slovenly. What's even more reassuring for the narcissistic parent is that they can now feel like they can control those feelings or fears of being slovenly, that because they are able to coerce their child into feeling what they themselves didn't want to feel. It can lend a sense of kind of omnipotence that's certainly not real, but is sought quite dearly, in fact, by someone who's narcissistically organized, or can be. When this type of dynamic happens over and again to the same child, then we can think of that child serving the role of scapegoat to their parent. The child's forced to adopt this identity as the worthless one to the parent because they have to find a way to share in their parent's reality no matter what. The alternative would have no reality to share in with their parent, and that ends up for the child feeling like they are nobody to no one. In essence, the parent saying something like, I can only, and I'm paraphrasing a quote by a psychoanalyst author named Jonathan Ogden. I don't want to plagiarize here. So anyway, the quote is something like, for a narcissistic parent in this case, I can only see what I put in you. And therefore, if I don't see that, I see nothing. And I think that kind of gets at the heart of that nobody to no one consequence if the parent, if the scapegoat child fails to comply with the role of scapegoat that the parent is insisting on seeing them as. So what happens to the scapegoat child's quality of life? I think the impacts of the scapegoat child's quality of life are that they must live in an upside down world where what is good for the development of their own self-worth, their sense of connection to others, particularly outside the family, and appreciation for their growing competencies all have to be avoided. Instead, the scapegoat child has to assume and seek out evidence to prove that they are defective and or undeserving. When this happens, they can take part in their narcissistic parent's reality and thereby stave off that danger of becoming nobody to no one. However, the cost is having to live in a world where their growth remains strictly forbidden. And that's why I'm calling it an upside down world. I think we're sort of born into the world as it is with an internal blueprint to grow upward and outward. But instead, the scapegoat child, again, to survive, has to invert that blueprint. In essence, make it upside down. So the result for the scapegoat child, and maybe later for the adult scapegoat survivor, is having to occupy an inner world that seems so vastly different from the worlds of others around them. And this is especially evident in life outside the home. Although the scapegoat child is regarded in ways at home that match the child's necessarily adopted beliefs that they're defective and undeserving, they very likely are going to encounter different information about who they are from, say, teachers, friends, or coaches. As encouraging as such information is, it also poses a threat to the scapegoat child for this very reason. Feedback that reflects the child's worth to others could very well interfere with that child's ability to think of themselves in the way their narcissistic parent demands. So the child has to develop an active kind of inner censor, CENSOR, that seeks and destroys such positive information about themselves. And this censor is responsible for all the yeah buts that a scapegoat child may say to themselves to discount evidence that they are different than how they are treated at home, or discount evidence they encounter outside the home. I should maybe take an aside here and say that psychoanalytic theory calls this inner censor the internal saboteur. I think that's kind of a more evocative term for it. It really brings to mind what we're talking about. This active part or internal saboteur prevents the child from identifying with the positive ways that they may be received outside the home. So this internal saboteur also alienates the child from their life and relationships outside the home. The child's not allowed to believe in the feedback they're getting from their friends, teachers, and coaches. And as a result, the child feels as though the people who understand them best, in fact, misunderstand them. We tend to, let me reverse that. I want to rephrase that. The child is kind of, when encountering this type of positive feedback outside the home, the people who are giving them this feedback likely seem very self-certain that they're seeing what's true, good, and accurate in the child. But the scapegoat child with this internal saboteur, activated, will often regard such people outside the home as misunderstanding who they are, because this child has to believe that the real version of who they are is someone who is there where there's something wrong with them, they're defective, and where they deserve less than other people, or in other words, they're undeserving. And so when the child kind of has to see people treating them well outside the home as just not really getting who they are, they will often feel distant to those people outside the home, because they'll feel like, boy, this person just doesn't understand me. We tend to feel separate from people whom we don't feel understand us. So the child, and then later that adult scapegoat survivor, have to create an inner world that they think accurately reflects who they are. And this inner world is centered along the assumptions of being defective and undeserving, as well as having this sort of active saboteur negating any feedback from others that would argue otherwise. Maintaining an inner world that's at such great odds with the rest of their lives, like how people are receiving them outside the family, can leave the scapegoat child and adult survivor feeling like they are fundamentally different and deeply alone in their broader life. They may likely find ways to go along and get along well enough in, say, school and maybe later at work, but they may still feel fundamentally different from everyone else around them. Well, there are, I think, two categories of reasons why the scapegoat child can feel like it's impossible, just, despite how much suffering's involved, to leave the upside down world where they have to insist on their defectiveness and undeservedness. First reason is that the adaptations that they had to make to stay in their narcissistic parents' reality insist that it's far too dangerous to live in any other way. I mean, after all, doing this in the past would have led to that unsurvivable state of being nobody to no one. So the ways that you may have had to insist on your badness and negate evidence of your goodness can affect you in some of the following ways. Your attentional processes may now be geared to only attend to information that reflects what's wrong with you, while selectively not attending to information that may reflect what's right with you. Or your efforts to look back at the ways you were treated in childhood to convince yourself that maybe you didn't deserve such treatment might leave you more absorbed in the past than liberated from it. Or your body might get stuck in that freeze state in order to disrupt the momentum that you might otherwise generate for yourself, under the sort of assumption here that such momentum, again, would go in the face of these beliefs of being defective and undeserving, which could threaten that sort of post-traumatic fear of being nobody to no one. And last, you move towards experiences, friendships, and relationships that might reinforce the idea that you are fundamentally bad while others are fundamentally good. The other reason why it can, I think, be so difficult to leave the upside down world is that initially a scapegoat survivor may have no other world to occupy. And of course, it's better to live in a bad world than to have no world at all to live in. At the outset of recovery, the notion of a world where the scapegoat survivor gets to feel safely deserving and adequate can seem like a farce. Kind of like going back to the example at the beginning, trying to envision kind of like succeeding in grad school and enjoying the work, and that having a future in that seemed very farcical. even if a scapegoat survivor can consider objective information about who they are that might support more healthy assumptions about themselves, it's living and acting as though these things are true can still feel and seem impossible. It can be very difficult for the scapegoat survivor kind of in this dilemma to pinpoint why for themselves. And this can often result in the survivor concluding that their difficulties knowing and living with what's right about them is yet more proof about what's wrong with them. Attempts to leave the upside down world can result in feeling profoundly disoriented and deeply afraid. And I think it's impossible to navigate this disorientation and intense fear on one's own. And I just want to pause because there's this, I'm dating myself a bit here, but the movie Beetlejuice, I think from like the late 80s with Michael Keaton, there's a great scene where the couple out played by Alec Baldwin and I forget the other lady's actress name, but anyway, they're in an attic and they can't leave the attic, and they try to. There's one scene where they try to, and they open this door, and they're like, there's this terrible sort of desolate, desert scene that like nobody would ever want to walk out the door and into. And that image just really came to mind in trying to kind of like articulate what this second reason can maybe seem and feel like when a scapegoat survivor may contemplate leaving this upside down world. Well, I want to offer you a tool to notice how the rules of the upside down world might be operating in your life today, and a way to understand the functions of these rules, the cost of following them today, and to envision what new rules may be available in a right side up world. And you can think of the upside down world as something like the world, now I'm going to bring another movie in, inhabited by the people, the actual humans in the movie The Matrix. So in that movie, everyone is plugged into a fantasy world that they have great difficulties seeing beyond. By identifying and seeing how the rules of the upside down world operate in your life today, you get to evaluate these rules rather than take them as facts. So I kind of see that as kind of seeing through the matrix in a way. And you'll, as I mentioned earlier, all receive an email after this presentation with a link to the instrument here that you see on the slide. And I do want to say one thing. I think what can make this exercise even more powerful is if that's in the tool, is if you can find someone in your life today to share your answers with. Because I truly believe that two things. One, sometimes it's necessary maybe to do this work alone at the outset when maybe it just feels overwhelmingly scary or dangerous to try to incorporate someone else. But ultimately, I think in order to make the progression in healing that I think all scapegoat survivors would want, it is necessary to find and participate in relationships where these efforts get to be understood by someone else who gets to feel safe enough, or there's at least high odds that they're safe. And the reason is that being able to share it in some way or another, I believe, makes it seem more real. Anyway. So the key to changing worlds from the upside down world to the right side up world, and sort of a segue from the point just now, I think is connection to other people. You can think of the scapegoat child's creation of their inner upside down world as a way to stave off that fundamental danger of being catastrophically alone. I mean, that's what being nobody to no one would sort of amount to. In order to leave this upside down world, then, I think it's imperative to find and stay in connection with other people today. Doing so accomplishes a few things. Your mind and body get to gradually know that the old danger of being alone if you leave the upside down world no longer actually happens. Such connections allow you to discover that you no longer have to abide by the rules of the upside down world, that you are defective and undeserving in order to make these connections last. Also, being in connection to other people today increases your ability to tolerate the disorientation and fear that can come from leaving the only world you know and moving towards a world that you want, but is entirely unfamiliar at the outset. And that's because you're no longer traveling alone in this path. Well, if connection's so important, then it seems also important to talk about where to find such connection. I want to start by saying I do not think there's any substitute for therapy. And I wholeheartedly recommend getting into therapy if at all possible. And here's why. Scapegoat survivors were deprived of having another protective caregiver be interested in their minds and available to help them understand themselves. And therapy, writ large, gives you this experience over and over. And that's important for scapegoat survivors to know that they can navigate that fear and disorientation that can come along with leaving the only world that they've known. I think also in therapy, you get kind of real-time corrective experience of seeing if it's still necessary to abide by the old rules that you have to find yourself to be defective and undeserving in order to make like the therapeutic relationship last or continue to work. The odds are extremely high that your therapist will respond to you in ways that say you no longer have to follow these rules for them and yourself to remain safe in the relationship. It's imperative to have such new experiences to know that you can truly break these rules today without ending up all alone like you would have in the past, were you to try to do such a thing. Another powerful option, I think, for finding connection today that can complement, certainly not substitute, participation in therapy is a live online group class that I call Breaking the Scapegoat Spell. So the scapegoat spell is sort of the entrenched belief that you have to still live by the beliefs of being defective and undeserving today. And so I think it's just another way of describing the scapegoat survivor's upside down world, in essence. And this class tackles those two main obstacles to leaving the upside down world. Again, first is that it feels extremely psychologically dangerous to consider new and good information about yourself. And two, that a world based on your worth and strengths seems distressingly unknown. And here's how. So first, you'll be taught powerful mind-body practices and tools to notice, interrupt, and redirect the energies that can go into staying in the upside down world. You'll learn ways to stay connected to the present moment while you visit some of your past pain so that you stay capable of integrating new information instead of getting subtly absorbed into the sort of bad old days. And I facilitate these groups and hand select partners for each person who I think are going to be a good match. So you get a chance to work together for the duration of the class and share your efforts of applying these kinds of tools in your life today. Sharing what you're trying to do for yourself with another trusted person, I do believe and have evidence makes your efforts feel more real and effective. So taken together, this aspect of the class helps you know you can safely break the rules of the upside down world. Second, you'll engage in exercises with your partner that help you think about and map out what your own right side up world can look like. You'll be asked to notice and gather evidence that supports this new world and share what you learn with your partner so that it all grows to feel more familiar and more real. You'll also complete exercises that help you name and talk about that disorientation and fear that can arise when moving towards your right side up world. All of this can help you know that you're no longer alone in moving to a world that likely fits you much better. And that can make it feel much more possible to migrate to this sort of right side up world than it may have ever been in the past. One other thing I want to mention is that the way the partner work happens is that it's very structured. And that means that each pair is instructed to say, okay, you get, let's say you get 5 minutes to work on an exercise in class, then you might get 4 minutes, one partner, to share with their other partner. Then that other partner gets 1 minute to just reflect back what they heard the first partner share. Then you take turns. And so the other partner shares for 4 minutes and then the other person reflects. Now, there's only 1 minute to reflect, and that builds into the structure an antidote to something that can happen, I think, often for scapegoat survivors, where it may feel very reflexive. It's like a reflex that when someone tells you how they're suffering, to feel like you got to get wholly absorbed in it, or even go over all the way sort of into them, because that may likely have been what was required in the past, or maybe the only way to eke out a sense of worth, like in a narcissistic family. So by only having a minute and only being able to sort of offer reflections as opposed to encouragement or praise or things such as that, it actually affords the experience, again, of giving something while staying rooted in your own experience. And anyway, I just want to mention that because I think that's super important. Anyway, if you think that this group might be helpful for you to start migrating out of the upside down world, assuming this idea resonates with you, there's going to be a link to that group in the follow-up email. And yeah, you can find that there. I think on YouTube, there'll also be a link to this YouTube Live once it's posted in the description box. Well, with that, I want to get into the question and answer period. And I wish I could have gotten to everyone's questions because they were all important, all extremely perceptive. And all that being said, I chose questions that I thought and hope have elements that might be fairly common to the experience of being the scapegoat child in a narcissistic family, and also common in the process of trying to recover from it. Okay, as you can see on the screen, the first question is, why did they choose me as the scapegoat? Well, I mean, wow, a quick and right to the heart of things question that really, I think, expresses the anguish and hurt that a child and even adult scapegoat survivor can experience from being born to expect to find love from their parents, but instead finding cruelty. In childhood, the way this question is typically thought about is for the child to find something within themselves to justify their parents' mistreatment. This can be where beliefs like I'm defective, or there's something wrong with me, or I'm undeserving come into play to help the child make sense of it in this specific way, where their parent has to be right, about scapegoating them or treating them in this kind of abusive fashion. But if we look at the situation between a narcissistic parent and their scapegoat child, I think there can be a few reasons why such a parent would choose a certain child to be a scapegoat at a given time. None of these reasons have anything to do with who that child actually is. They all reflect efforts on the narcissistic parent's part to manage their inflated yet extremely fragile self-worth. And I guess by that, I don't mean that it's like, let's say a narcissistic parent, derides or devalues their scapegoat child for, I don't know, having like a poor skin complexion as an adolescent. Not poor, just having a few pimples or something. Well, I'm not saying that they're making something up. Like the scapegoat child or adolescent may in fact have a few pimples, but the way in which the parent sort of like accentuates that and sort of makes it into this disgusting feature or something along those lines, that aspect has nothing to do with who the child actually is, just to clarify. For example, a child's natural way of being in the world may signal to the narcissistic parent that the child possesses something which that parent covets and feels like they don't themselves possess. Like sometimes a narcissistic parent who's maybe insecure about their physical looks will envy and then want to destroy a child, again, through no fault of the child's own, who that parent perceives as having the good looks that their parent covets. And in such cases, it's the child's just existence that puts the parent in touch with the worthlessness that the parent feels they're constantly running from. When such a parent can mistreat their child until that child sees no value in who they are or their own appearance, then the parent may feel like they have eliminated the threat to their self-esteem that they perceive their child to pose to them. Another reason why a child may be selected as a scapegoat is when the child is sort of just temperamentally oriented towards honesty. The child who openly calls out the unfairness of their narcissistic parent's treatment of them can be at risk of being perceived as a threat by their parent. A narcissistic parent traffics in distortions of reality, distortions that favor them and disfavor certain others. If their child tends to call things as they see them, then the child may be initially less pliable to their parents' distortive efforts. And this can make their narcissistic parent double down on getting such a child to comply with the narcissistic parent's distorted version of reality, where their parent is superior and this child is supposedly inferior. Placing the child into the role of scapegoat as the kid who has something wrong with them and doesn't see the world the way it is, again, supposedly, can help the narcissistic parent neutralize the threat that this child's clear perception of reality poses them. Well, fantastic question. And these answers by no means are exhaustive. Really, they're sort of, I think, jumping off points. Anyway, so the next question, my narcissistic mother always said she is the only one who would ever care for me, and that no one else could ever, and that no one else could ever care for me. Even though I have a degree and work experience, I find myself at mid-30s, 90% dependent on her. I can see that she loves it. I smile, but I feel deep contempt. How can I start applying care to myself without feeling threatened? And how can I become self-sufficient? Well, this is another great question. The writer describes being treated as a psychological extension of her mother, where the writer, W-R-I-T-E-R, where the writer is forbidden from having her own separate identity if she wants to be connected to her mother. Her mother explicitly curated this by telling the client that her mother, is the only one who could ever care for her, and that if she were to look elsewhere for care, she'd find nobody. So this is another, I think, common and important aspect in the process of trying to recover from narcissistic abuse, in this case, psychologically and emotionally separate from a narcissistic parent who regards you as an extension of themselves with, it seems like, a very or else message of punishment and abandonment and withdrawal if you do not comply. So the writer describes what I think is this sort of anesthetized state of psychological merger that her mother seems to have coercively imposed upon her. And by merger, I just mean that her mother seems to be only happy with her when the writer seems to be unable to function without her mother. There are overtones of kindness and mirth in this arrangement with her mother, it seems, that the writer really doesn't like participating in upon reflection, yet finds it very difficult to resist and openly express how much she wants to be separate and not go along with the sort of like bonhomie, it sounds like, that her mother coercively insists upon. I think it'd be impossible for anyone to seize their own autonomy from such a parent, and even in adulthood, without experiencing a sense of danger and even perhaps crippling guilt upon trying to separate. And this is because a parent like this sends the message to the child that the child is responsible for that parent's emotional well-being. And the writer describes her mother's emotional well-being to be contingent on the writer, I should say, to be contingent on her child needing her. When this happens, it can feel like what the child does or doesn't do is going to make or break that parent. So in cases like these, it can feel or be very understandably like it can feel understandably like putting yourself first, acting independently, and or pursuing your own goals is going to be what breaks your parent. And if that seems to be the case, then you can suffer an excruciating level of self-blame and guilt. So to navigate these pitfalls that can arise when trying to separate from such a subtly domineering parent, I think it's imperative, and I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's imperative to find and participate in new relationships that operate much differently. In a situation like this, I'd say that therapy, if it's not already in place, would definitely be called for. And this form of a new relationship can give you the needed experience that acting independently doesn't endanger your, in this case, a therapist's goodwill or emotional stability. It doesn't threaten either of that when you act independently. Quite the opposite of what the writer describes experiencing with her mother. And these sort of corrective or antidotal experiences, I think, are needed to happen over time to lessen the guilt and blame that might be interfering with separating from a parent like this at the moment. I think, too, another piece of therapy that can be so important is just getting a new frame of reference of, why and how such intense guilt arises with such a parent, building like a new frame of reference about it with someone else whom you grow to hopefully trust, can be really, really helpful in kind of convincing yourself that although the guilt is there, it doesn't have to be believed at 100%. Okay, and the third question is this. The writer says, my father created his own narrative about me, calling me Monsieur, as if I were some spoiled man who expected to be served, someone who had and someone who hadn't earned anything. To him, I was a loser, a disappointment, arrogant, selfish, even not his son. He wanted to turn me into a broken, homeless failure while pretending to be superior. I had to stay rational while he raged and humiliated me like the lowest kind of man. He broke me down so deeply that my life stopped feeling worth living. And how could I ever prove that? He was unemployed for years, hiding behind his wife while destroying my sense of worth piece by piece. And somehow that same look, that judgment of you don't deserve it, kept following me. I saw it again and again in the eyes of older men, bosses, people in power. It's like they all recognized the story he wrote about me and kept repeating it. How do you ever prove the kind of damage that doesn't leave visible scars? Well, geez, the writer of this question gives us an extremely, I think, emotionally evocative understanding of what it was like for him to grow up in the upside down world he was forced to inhabit with his narcissistic father. The writer describes how his father curated a derisive, contemptuously mocking, and rejecting stance towards him. And based on the writer's account of his father's fortunes in his father's own life, we might assume that the man dealt with his own feeling, that his father dealt with his own feelings of worthlessness that he denied, relocated onto his son, and then acted in the ways that the writer describes to get his son to identify as the worthless one. Again, for being supposedly arrogant and all that business. I was struck by the writer's awareness of how his father's claims that he thought that how his father's claims that that the writer thought he was better than everyone else were in fact his father's attempts to devalue him. And yet the writer is at a loss for how to free himself from that you don't deserve it look that he saw so much from his father and now sees in the eyes of authority figures around him. Well, this question, I think, and the theme that this question addresses can be a common one in the experience of scapegoat survivors. You might have tremendous awareness over the wrongness of how your narcissistic parent specifically devalued, deprived, and domineered you. However, it can seem like those responses live in the hearts and minds of certain people in your life today. And one of the reasons these painful lessons from the past as a scapegoat child seem to reoccur in life today is that it's tremendously hard to psychologically and emotionally separate from such an abusive parent. Paradoxically, and here's why, paradoxically, we form more intense bonds with parents who mistreat us than with those who treat us well. And this is because the scapegoat child of a narcissistic parent has to do all the work in the relationship. They know that they are just serving a function for the parent and are not really loved nor valued for the love they have to offer by their parent. To make this situation survivable for the child, they have to get even closer to the parent in an emotional and psychological sense. And the way this can happen the most for the scapegoat child is to experience every facet of their life, even those that are outside of their family, as though their narcissistic parent is there and is in charge. Doing so creates a sense of psychological nearness to this parent that has afforded relief from the alternative of feeling like you're nobody, or excuse me, of feeling like you have nobody to attach to. And of course, thereby suffering that fate of being nobody to no one. So when the writer how experiencing today, excuse me, what the writer describes experiencing today may reflect an unconscious effort to persist in what he used to need. That is, continuing to live as though his narcissistic parent is still around and in charge. With my understanding of the situation, I in no way want to critique the writer for doing this. It's I think a very needed adaptation to an impossible situation, and certainly and likely was historically. So then to the main thrust of this question, what can the writer and people in the situation do to know for certain that they live in a much more supportive, genuinely encouraging world than they did in the past? And I have two ideas to submit here. First is really to continue doing what the writer describes himself to be doing. That is, continuing working to reach his potential in whatever endeavors are important to him. In doing so, the anxiety and shame he describes feeling when he sees authority figures giving him that "you don't deserve it" look, I think will tend to decrease over time. Maybe a long time, but still nonetheless. Very much like that treatment for obsessive compulsive disorder, where the idea is to expose yourself to whatever makes you anxious, interrupt the impulse to flee or avoid, and stay in contact with the anxious experience so that your system gets to have the repeated experience that the feared outcome doesn't occur. You can think of it like if someone's afraid of germ contamination and they think that doorknobs have tons of germs and they'll contract a terrible disease if they touch it. This treatment paradigm would in essence, making it simple, but say touch the doorknob and don't engage in what usually nullifies your anxiety, which is maybe washing your hands. Stay with that anxiety, and it sucks initially, but over time the intensity of the anxiety naturally decreases. In the writer's case, this may grow to mean seeing how those looks of disdain that he thinks he's seeing in the authority figures around him are not followed up by the derisive contempt he describes that his father would so often express to him. And second, the second idea about how to kind of, rid oneself of these narcissistic figures, psychologically speaking, today, is using good relationships in your life today to continually talk about what all this is like for you. The writer seems to suffer from a lack of validation for what he went through with his father, in the questions of how can I prove this? As we participate in and center our lives around new relationships where you feel respected, admired at times, appreciated, and loved, then the norms of the old scapegoat upside down world can come into even greater relief. And that is, you get to see them in more distinct, they're more distinct and more clear. And because of the contrast between now and the good relationships and safety experienced today, this can make it much easier to know that the abuse you suffered in the past was in fact real. I think too that the writer has an exquisite grasp of that at some place in him, that it was in fact real, but wholly get and respect his question that but the sense of that nagging sense of wanting to prove and know that it's real. Again, I want to thank everyone for your submitted questions, and Yeah, I think it's just afforded such a, again, springboard into some really, really important facets of this scapegoat person's experience. Okay, next steps. Well, as I mentioned in the beginning, I intend for these to be a monthly series, and I hope you'll come back next month for next month's free webinar on Thursday, December 11th, again at 4 p.m. PST, and they're going to happen on the second Thursday of every month. Another step is resourcing yourself. There's like I think a truism when it comes to recovering from trauma in the theory and research of it, that it is so critical to find and resource oneself in essence before kind of going in to the steps of processing the trauma. And there's plenty of ways to resource yourself, particularly relationally. I also just want to offer that you can go to my website and find some step-by-step paths towards recovery, both some if you're ready to invest in, but also plenty of free resources that can be helpful. And if you want to review today's webinar, you can check your email after this class for a link to the recording, the free tool that I mentioned earlier, a copy of this presentation, the actual slides, and a link to learn more about that Breaking the Scapegoat Spell group. Well, again, thank you everyone for attending, and I hope to see, see some of you next month. Take care.